So, I figured that some people are wondering why I want to learn/relearn the specific languages involved in my most recent challenge. I mean, there's French, an official language of Canada, the country we live in. That one seems like an easy choice. Being bilingual is a massively important skill for finding work, particularly in the government in Canada. Then there's Italian. I lived in Italy for 2 years, so maybe learning this language is some misguided mission to finally be able to integrate into a society which, from my experience, has little regard for those who don't speak the language. And German. I started learning German in high school because I had 1 credit to fill in my grade 10 year. And then I somehow ended up with the highest average in the class and won an award for it. To top it off, I've got a German last name, and that doesn't hurt. But the truth about why I want to learn these 3 specific languages is much more simple than that. I want to better understand English. Now, at first glance, this seems counterintuitive. If I wanted to better understand one language, shouldn't I study that specific language? But where these 3 languages come in handy for learning English is in the history of my mother tongue. Because you see, English hasn't always been the way it is today, and that is something that is important to understand. Consider, for example, the phrase, "I just Googled myself on my BlackBerry." If someone were to say this to you, you would know exactly what they were talking about. But going back a short time span, even within your lifetime, this phrase would likely have earned you a few raised eyebrows. So minor changes can occur to a language, we all know that. Old words gain new meanings or die off entirely, and new words are constantly added. Consider then a phrase like, "Herra is no way, ibis, ne no wit else but ficht, without fomen, for fle, me veneve." Sounds like an entirely different language, doesn't it? But then, where is it from? The fact is, this too is English, just not the English that we know today. We don't understand this type of English, a dialect of Middle English, because languages, every once in a while, undergo massive shifts under the pressure of widespread societal changes. And so English, as a matter of fact, has common ancestry with several other living languages. Chief amongst them are German, French, and, well, not Italian exactly, but the mix of Latin and ancient Greek, particular to the Romans of the early centuries of this era, which is close enough. The earliest forms of English are, in effect, a precursor to modern German, the result of several invasions onto the British Isles by the Germanic tribes of northwestern Europe. A collective language of invasion came to be known as English, after the Angles, who, along with the Saxons, held most of what is now England and parts of Scotland. This early form of the language of England is now called Old English, and is all but incomprehensible to most modern-day English speakers. A second influence in the language came from the colonization of Britain by Imperial Rome. Between 43 CE and 409 CE, the Romans kept trading settlements and, at various points, standing armies on the British Isles. This led, of course, to the assimilation of Latin and Greek words into Old English as a means of facilitating trade and military treaties. Thus, English had evolved to include common everyday words adopted from the Romans. 700 years later, though, the language would see change in the most drastic way thus far. This change was the result of the Norman invasion. What the Normans spoke wasn't, strictly speaking, French. Like Old English had been a Proto-Germanic language, so too was Old Norman a Proto-French language. But nonetheless, the imposition of Norman language onto the British facilitated the change from Old English, peppered with Latin and Greek from the Roman occupation, to Middle English, halfway between German and French. Because nearly all court and government activities were conducted in Old Norman, the English language was forced to assimilate the ruling power. As a practical example of this change, consider a trick of language. The Old English speakers were now subjugated by the Old Norman-speaking conquerors. Thus, it was the responsibility of the subjugated to please the conquerors by raising livestock to put on the Normans' dinner plates. But the Normans, it is often joked, never saw the animals they were eating. Thus, when dealing with the animals directly, we use the Old English term, and when dealing with the food the animals produce, we use the Old Norman. And so in the English language, we have the term cow for the animal, and beef for the food, swine for the animal, and pork for the food, hen for the animal, and poultry for the food. We can see then in the very functioning of modern-day English a historical struggle between conquerors and their subjects. The point of all this is that it becomes much easier to understand the mysteries of the English language when you know where the language has been over time. By learning French, German, and Italian, I hope to be able to understand each step in the evolution of our language and appreciate my native tongue for what it really is, a record of the history of an island off the western coast of Europe, and all of the people who, in one way or another, speak this language as the result of that one little island. And to conclude with Battleship, your attack on D4 was a miss, and I attack J4.